Thanks for asking us. It's an honour to be here, and it's nice to be in a meeting with various age groups as well. So thanks for coming out tonight. And solidarity to those of you who are on strike. I'm sure there's some amongst you that are currently taking strike action or have taken strike action, or at least supporting some kind of strike action, because the strike's going on everywhere, as we know. And we're continually reminded of how relevant the year-long 84-5 miners' strike is, and justice for Orgreave in relation to everything that's going on economically, politically and legally today. So we thankfully currently see many workers taking strike action on a massive scale. Hundreds and thousands of workers and supporters mobilising for better services, pay and conditions. But the Tories are still cruelly punishing us all for it. So I just want to give you a bit of the background of the miners' strike and the build-up to where we are now, I suppose. The thing about the miners' strike that many of you may or may not know was that it wasn't about pay. The 84-5 miners' strike was nothing to do with pay. It was an attempt by the National Union of Mine Workers to preserve jobs, to preserve the coal mining industry in Britain, to preserve communities and the trade union movement. And it wasn't just for the miners, it was for all of us. So miners were taking action for all of us. So March 1984-5 was a year like no other. Approximately 160,000 miners were striking in response to government plans for the accelerated and unnecessary mass closure of coal mines. Remember, this is 1984, throughout Britain, with a potential loss of 70,000 jobs. The Tories lied. They said many of the pits were uneconomic. That wasn't true. This lie also included them asserting that there would only be job losses of 20,000 only. That's what they were saying. This was a calculated campaign of misinformation to persuade miners and the public that the NUM, the National Union of Mine Workers, had absolutely no grounds for saying that the National Coal Board had a closure hit list of at least 70 pits. So a letter to miners from the National Coal Board, redrafted and delayed by Thatcher, was finally sent out on the 21st of June 1984, bearing in mind the strike started in March 1984. And this letter was sent out 3 days after the 18th of June, when the police rioted at Orgreave. That's what happened. The police rioted at Orgreave, stating that the NCB was seeking 20,000 voluntary redundancies and not the 70,000 claimed by the National Union of Mine Workers. So they were using that letter to try and obviously con the miners after Orgreave. So the government involvement and the policing, an outcome of that strike, set the tone for industrial relations in the policing of strikes and demonstrations in Britain. That set the tone. Been other terrible situations before then, and obviously there's been other terrible situations since, but that really set the tone for the policing of strikes in Britain. And the Tories used everything at their disposal to ensure that the strike that they engineered that strike, was broken. So they've been stockpiling coal, they've been getting miners to do overtime as part of the build-up, because they knew that the NUM would oppose their pit closure programme. So they engineered the strike. So we clearly see that the devastation and social deprivation caused by pit closures has had painful and lasting effects for the working class of Britain. Austerity for us means the wealth of the richest increases, you know all this, whilst wages are kept down and homelessness, fuel, food and energy poverty escalates. Meanwhile, Britain sleepwalks into fascism, as refugees and asylum seekers are often scapegoated for this Tory programme. Draconian legislation from the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Act, which means you can be recruited as a spy cop, and with impunity. The Crime Sentencing and Court Act, and now the Public Order Act, that's recently been rushed through Parliament, so you can't demonstrate against coronations and things like that, hands more right to the police and steamrolls over our rights to the point of criminalising those of us who protest against these injustices and inequalities. So we now find ourselves fighting a social justice campaign, and we'll be criminals for doing it. I mean, you couldn't make this nonsense up. Our right to protest against what is being done to us is under serious threat, and the right-wing propaganda machine supporting the Tories is absolutely terrifying. The NUM are currently amongst 250 core participants in the current undercover policing inquiry, which has only just got going and is expected to run for over 10 years. Some of us will probably be dead by then. But of course, this is exactly the neoliberal world the Tories yearned for when the state orchestrated their unrelenting attack on the miners and the strongest union at that time, which was the National Union of Mine Workers, the NUM. So, the beginning of what happened at Orgreave. In June 1984, the miners' strike against the Tory plans for the mass pit closures had been going on for 3 months. The Cold War was raging. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and US President Ronald Reagan were colluding to boost their nuclear capability while waging war on their own population. Their devotion to monetarism and increasing the role of the private market required shifting politics sharply to the right, such as had happened after the fascist dictatorship that they supported was established in Chile in 1973, 50 years ago, when a democratically elected socialist government was overthrown by a United States-backed military coup. The Tory warmongers had tasted a quick victory, some of you will remember this, in their war to maintain control of the Falklands Islands. That was in 1982, giving them a renewed confidence and an opportunity to whip up jingoism. War and the language of war is their antagonistic discourse. They perpetuate and understand that kind of talk. Class war was and still is in full throttle. So the relevance of the year-long strike will always remain. We must never forget or forgive what the Tories orchestrated and the police did throughout mining communities all over Britain and to striking miners at Orgreave in June 84. So just to track back a bit, mining communities had been thriving. The NUM was a strong militant trade union who had successfully improved health and safety at work, pay and terms and conditions for miners who were doing, let's face it, a difficult, dirty and incredibly dangerous job. Supporters knew what was at stake, and the strike galvanised a lot of us grassroots trade unionists and community solidarity and support. The support and solidarity that strike received in Britain and throughout the world was phenomenal. And don't let anybody ever tell you otherwise. It was fantastic. It wasn't fantastic from the leadership of the Labour Party and the TUC, but it was fantastic from everybody else who was active politically. The outcome of the strike and the government's carefully choreographed input became the blueprint for the policing of dissent and industrial relations in Britain. So the Tories used every means possible to sabotage the strike that they'd engineered and ensured that what they said, not what they actually did, was reported to their advantage by their friends in their media to demonise the victims, the miners and the rest of us. So the Tory government strategy of the 80s to dismantle and privatise the nationalised industries and destroy the mass trade union membership and negotiating strength of workers within those industries, such as railways, steel, electricity and gas. This all stemmed from the victorious miners' strike of 1972. So I'm going back a few years now. In 1972, I was 11, but I do remember it quite well. The Tories have been punishing us for this ever since. Last year, was the 50th anniversary of the mass pickets that took place at the Saltley Gate coking plant in Birmingham. Approximately 400 miners and thousands of engineers and supporters, many of those supporters were women, successfully closed the cokework gates and won a significant pay increase and played a pivotal role in the Heath Tory government's election defeat in 1974. I don't know if there's anybody in the room who was around at the time, but I think Heath said something like, it's either us who rule the country or the trade unions. And I think at that time people thought it should be the trade unions, so they got rid of the Tories, and the Tories have not forgiven us for it. The Nationalised Industries Policy Group report. Now, some of you might know of that, but you know of it as the Ridley Plan. It was the Tories' revenge, and it became their tool to subjugate the powerful National Union of Mine Workers and the rest of us. So we're back to this talk of warlike language again. They actually, in this report, they talk of battles with trade unions and regarded nationalised industries as the enemies. They were hell-bent on waging war against organised labour and destroying the trade union movement. That's what the Ridley report was about and the Ridley Plan was about. So they were making secret plans. Willie Whitelaw, I think, was the Home Secretary at the time. They were making secret plans, but they weren't, when I say secret, there was no parliamentary discussion about any of this, and they weren't even discussing it with other people in their own political party. To administer violent state oppression while hiding behind the illusion of policing by consent. You've seen it before, seen it all before. And the plans were drawn up from crowd control techniques perfected in colonial Hong Kong and Northern Ireland. Surprise, surprise. Proposed paramilitary tactics included horse chargers, collective police chants, snatch squads, weapons and CS gas. And you can read more about it in a book that we've been involved in promoting called Charged. I think I might have put a leaflet on the back. It's written by Matt Foote and Morag Livingston, and it's about how the police try to suppress protest. And it's an excellent book, and there's a section in there about Orgreave and the miners' strike. So what happened at Orgreave? Orgreave was a processing plant on the border of Sheffield and Rotherham, and it turned coal into coke to be transported to the Scunthorpe British Steel furnaces. So the NUM had been picketing Orgreave to prevent scab lorries from moving the coke. They'd held regular pickets and they'd mobilised for a mass picket on the 18th of June 1984. Excuse me. This was in an attempt to boost morale and add to the effectiveness of the strike. And I think, and it's often said, a hope for a repeat of what happened at Saltley Gate. However, as we know now, the state and the police were fully prepared. It was a setup. While thousands of striking miners were slowly gathering at Orgreave from all over Britain, thousands of police were gathering from all over Britain and were waiting for them. The figures vary. I mean, we've got all sorts of figures. Some say that there were approximately 10,000 miners and approximately 6,000 police. It doesn't really matter. It was a scorching hot day. The atmosphere was friendly and good humoured. Even if there were more miners than police, the miners were wearing jeans and T-shirts. They were gathering to picket and show solidarity and support for each other. They were having a laugh. They were having a good time. Some were even playing games of bowls and cricket and football. You've probably seen some of the photos. But what followed at Orgreave on that day was not a battle. It was a police riot, organised and sanctioned brutality and tactics of the most sustained and vicious kind ever seen in an industrial dispute in Britain. The miners were lured into a field, so they were all arriving to picket. The police were greeting them. I think they thought they were at a football match or something. it wasn't anything like what they've been used to with the roadblocks and not being allowed to move around the country. And some of them have said now they should have known it was a trap. But, you know, they were being convivial. They'd not seen each other for a while. You know, emotions were running high. South Yorkshire Police Assistant Chief Constable Clement had ordered the police lines to open. So the police were lined up and he suddenly ordered it. You've probably seen the footage on television. If you haven't, I suggest that you try and watch a film called Still the Enemy Within. It's an excellent film. And it's probably one that you might want to show, Jordan, if you've not shown it already. So dozens of mounted officers armed with long truncheons charged up the field, followed by snatch squad officers in riot gear with short shields and truncheons. The miners fled up the hill towards the embankment and the railway bridge. I don't know whether any of you know Orgreave area at all. It's very different now. There's a massive housing estate and a university where the coking plant used to be. But there's still evidence of the road and the fields there, so it is worth going down to have a look. Many of those who couldn't or wouldn't run were assaulted by batons, causing several serious injuries, and dragged back through the police lines to the temporary detention centre opposite the plant. So the police had got all the detention centres all set up. Several similar charges followed, forcing miners up into the village, so the bottom of Orgreave Lane and Highfield, where they tried to find refuge in gardens. They were jumping over people's walls and fences in gardens and yards and of the industrial units that were opposite. A lot of people who lived in the house on the road were getting them in the houses and hiding them and trying to look after them because they could see what was going on. The police ran amok, clubbing and arresting miners indiscriminately. In one piece of TV footage, and I know Jordan's seen this, but we weren't allowed to show it because we actually get charged a fee for showing some of the footage that we've tried to show and some of the photographs that we've tried to show. You can hear an officer shouting, "Bodies, not heads." So they were actually under instructions not to hit any of the miners on the heads. But the number of head injuries sustained by the miners meant that was ignored. And I think we understand that one of the police said that he could see other police doing heads and he just thought it was, you know, free rein to do what they liked. So they did. When the lawyers eventually arrived later in the day to support the detained miners, I remember Gareth Pearce in particular saying many of them should have actually been in hospital, not in a prison cell. They were so badly beaten and attacked, and it's a miracle that nobody died. One officer was seen on television straddling a defenceless miner on the ground and battering him repeatedly about the head with his truncheon. So this is actually on television. I mean, you could see it at the time. Because the incident was witnessed by millions on TV, South Yorkshire Police apparently interviewed the officer, PC Martin, from the Northumbria Force 2 days later. The interview papers were referred to the Director of Public Prosecutions, who advised that PC Martin should not be prosecuted. And there is no record of PC Martin being disciplined either. Altogether, 55 miners were arrested at the top side of Orgreave, and all of them were charged with riot, an offence which at that time carried a potential life sentence. A further 40 miners were arrested at the bottom part, the Catcliffe side, and they were charged with the marginally less serious offence of unlawful assembly. The right-wing media lied, surprise, surprise, and said the miners had attacked the police first and that the police were defending themselves. The BBC News even reversed the footage that evening to imply the first attack came from the miners. So when we all saw the news that night, we couldn't believe what we were seeing. I mean, I wasn't at Orgreave that day, but my partner was on his way to Orgreave. He didn't get there, thankfully. We just knew that wasn't true. We knew that had not happened. And this was punishment for going out on strike for the right to work. That's what was going on. So the strike carries on. It carries on till March 1985. But throughout that year, those arrested miners had to wait until May 1985 for their cases to go to court, with all the upset, the anxiety that involved for them, their families, comrades and friends. So all that worry. There were miners under curfew all over the country. Mining towns and villages were occupied by the police. 15 miners, all charged with riot, appeared at Sheffield Crown Court in what was intended by the prosecution to be the first of a series of trials. The trial collapsed after 48 days of hearings when the prosecution abandoned the case, and it became clear that the police witnesses trooping in and out of court, that many officers had large parts of their statements dictated to them. So we all know about Hillsborough, and that many of them had lied in their accounts, claiming to have seen things they couldn't have seen, or that they had arrested someone they hadn't arrested. One statement with a signature forged by a police officer simply disappeared from court over lunchtime, never to reappear. It also emerged in the course of the trial that new and unlawful public order policing tactics set out in a secret police manual had been used for the first time at Orgreave. That was a consequence of the Ridley plan. And at times the trial apparently descended into farce. The prosecution, cutting its losses, dropped the cases of the remaining 80 miners. So none of the 95 miners that they'd arrested were prosecuted. So you might think, okay, they weren't prosecuted. There was never any investigation into the conduct of the police for assaulting, wrongfully arresting and falsely prosecuting so many miners, nor for lying in evidence. Not a single officer faced disciplinary or criminal proceedings. 5 years later, however, and a year after the Hillsborough disaster, South Yorkshire Police agreed to pay a total of nearly £500,000 to 39 of the miners who decided to take them to court. But they never admitted that they'd done anything wrong. The government never acknowledged their political role in the direction of the police actions, and neither they or the police were ever held to account. So anyone who's aware of the systemic and violent police operations used against miners all over Britain throughout the strike will understand that the Tory government had prepared and mobilised unprecedented resources to undermine, demoralise, humiliate, criminalise and discredit the miners, the NUM and its leaders. And throughout that strike, there were over 11,000 arrests made over a year. Many miners lost their jobs and many were blacklisted. So how long have I got?
Another 10 minutes.
Yeah. So I just want to talk really a little bit about women in the strike, because women played a really pivotal role in that strike. And I was a trade union activist at the time. I was in my early 20s and an active trade unionist, but I was also a member of Women Against Pit Closures. And in March 1984, a number of women active in local politics and mining communities in Yorkshire and throughout Britain organised support and solidarity for the miners, bearing in mind that the National Union Mine Workers National Office was based in Sheffield, so we played quite a key role, really. The National Coal Board and media had tried to use wives and partners and families of miners to support an anti-strike campaign and weaken industrial disputes. They'd done that over several miners' strikes when they'd been on strike for money. Sometimes it had worked. Most of the time it actually hadn't worked. But unemployment was high. You know, the Tories were in power. Benefits were being cut. Job threats to future generations meant that many women were supportive of the strike because they knew what was happening. They knew what was going to happen next if the miners lost. So the Women Against Pit Closures groups were formed. And the women came from a variety of cultural backgrounds. In addition to the many miners' wives and partners, there were local government workers, home workers, engineers, students, peace, anti-racist campaigners, etc. But we all had a desire to see a successful conclusion to the strike and a future for communities and the preservation of the coal industry. There were a few differences of opinion about whether the women should just be from mining communities or whether, you know, there were different ideas. There were women who'd been involved in the peace movement who were quite supportive and instrumental in helping and supporting a lot of people as well. And the women fundraised, fed communities, went on pickets, marched, organised events, meetings, rallies, and spoke in support of the strike. So we played a really major role. And it was unprecedented for a lot of women, actually. It was quite life-changing. And it encouraged a lot of ordinary people to put socialist feminist ideas into practice, really, in an industrial dispute, which was, let's face it, male-dominated. And take on very public and leading roles. So as the strike got longer and hardship bit deeper, the women's resolve became stronger. And some of the men say now, if we could have had our way, they'd probably still be on strike now. So many of the women who previously been non-political were politicised. There were lots of women who were activists at the time who were involved. So I don't want to create this sort of rosy picture of women who aren't political and then suddenly have an awakening, because that wasn't the case. But it was for some of them. And in May 1984, 5,000 women from pit villages and across the country attended a rally in Barnsley. You've probably seen one of the famous pictures by a photographer called Martin Jenkinson. And a few months later, 23,000 women from mining communities and supporters marched through London. So it was a big movement, and it was very, very uplifting. Mining towns and villages were occupied by large numbers of police from all over Britain. There were roadblocks set up on motorways to prevent strikers and supporters travelling to pits and coking plants to be involved in secondary picketing. That was when all the secondary picketing laws were coming out about you couldn't have more than, I think it was 6 on a picket line. I'm not quite sure what the rules are now. So if there's any lawyers in the room, if you could enlighten us, please, as to what those laws actually are. So when picket numbers were severely restricted, the police used riot gear, horses, dogs, and they were using them in the villages. They were using kettling at the time. They were provocating people using verbal abuse. They were trying to terrorise strikers and supporters, arresting people on spurious and false charges, waving money in front of the miners, saying, "Oh, we've got this on overtime." I mean, it was just horrific, and they knew that they could do what they liked, and a lot of them just did. They assaulted people on picket lines. They left strikers needing urgent medical attention in other places, not just at Orgreave. Orgreave was just one of many examples of extreme acts of police violence, and it was all orchestrated and sanctioned by the state. So police violence and police violence against women is nothing new. We've often been at the forefront of political struggle, as you know, and we've had to endure a lot of sexism along the way, not just from the state, but sadly from some of our own comrades. But hopefully a lot of that changes. It's still not how we would like it to be, but just a few examples: the match women, the chain makers, women's suffrage, women's liberation, Grunwick, Greenham Common, Ford Sewing Machinists, Hull Fisheries campaigners, women against pit closures, Reclaim the Streets. We've seen a massive input from women, and we want to see more acknowledgement for the role that women play. And next year we're going to have quite a few women against pit closure occasions, just to remind people of the massive role that we played. So just in terms of our campaign, and there's some leaflets on the back table. There's an information leaflet here, and this goes into some brief detail of why we want an inquiry and what we want out of an inquiry. So just over 10 years ago, we set up the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign. And at that time, we wanted a public inquiry. We were asking for a public inquiry. As times rolled on, we were becoming to realise that public inquiries aren't all they're cracked up to be. But we want some kind of independent inquiry into the police riot and the state involvement in the mass picket at Orgreave. We want to use Orgreave as the example to highlight what happened throughout the whole strike, in the hope that there'll be more investigations into what happened. We want to ensure that the true narrative of what happened throughout the strike is finally placed in the public domain. The NUM and other social justice activists, campaigners, lawyers and politicians have been working since 1984 to try and highlight this. So this isn't something that's just suddenly started 10 years ago. But 10 years ago, we saw an opportunity because of what had happened with the 2012 Hillsborough Independent Panel into the Hillsborough Stadium disaster, which I think a lot of you will be quite familiar with. We produced a legal submission with lawyers, and we took it to two Tory Home Secretaries. Theresa May, who was making a lot of noises at that time about how she wanted to see better policing in Britain. And then, of course, we had all the European stuff. And she became Prime Minister, and Amber Rudd took over as Home Secretary. But they very heavily implied that there would be some kind of inquiry into Orgreave. This was now 2016. Now, the time was building up to October 2016. We'd been told that by the 31st of October, we'd have a decision as to whether there'd be an inquiry or not. In early October or late September, there was an article in the Times, would you believe, saying that there would be some kind of Orgreave inquiry. It would possibly be a single judge-led inquiry. So we were then feeling a little bit anxious because we thought, well, if it's just going to be one judge, we've got no chance. But we'll wait and see. So we were genuinely shocked when we were all down in London waiting for the announcement, when Amber Rudd stood up in Parliament and rejected any kind of inquiry at all, rejected it outright. And the reasons she gave, and if it wasn't so serious, it could be hilarious. The reasons she gave was, it was a long time ago. There were no miscarriages of justice. There were no deaths. And this is the hilarious one, more hilarious than the others. Policing had improved since 1984 and there was nothing new to learn. So, I mean, we were devastated. We reflected on it quite a lot and thought, well, we didn't get a single led judge, but this gives us some kind of momentum to carry on with this campaign and really let us alert everybody to what's going on. Now, we were approached not long after by the Bishop of Sheffield, a guy called Pete Wilcox. And we thought, oh God, what's going on here? A lot of us are atheists anyway. So we were a bit suspicious. He'd been the kind of second in command to, I think it's James Jones, who was the Bishop of Liverpool, who played quite a key role in the Hillsborough Independent Panel. So Pete Wilcox had seen what had gone on in relation to the Hillsborough Independent Panel, and he was really keen. He'd arrived in Sheffield, and he was hearing a lot about Orgreave, and he was really keen to help to develop an independent panel. So he worked with us to contact Sajid Javid, who was then the next Home Secretary, because we were getting through quite a few Home Secretaries by this time, and said it would be of public benefit. Some government papers relating to Orgreave and the strike have been released, and the National and Local Archives, but are extremely difficult to access. So they'd all come out after the Amber Rudd's 2016 announcement. But we'd also found out that some of the other files and papers are still embargoed until 2066 and 2071. So, they've obviously got stuff they want to cover up. Many government papers released under 30-year rule that we've seen highlight government involvement, Thatcher's handwriting on the minutes about getting more police. This was after she'd stated categorically at conferences and on television that the government would not be involved and are not involved in the miners' strike. So despite us, Sajid Javid rejected the bishop, and despite us regularly writing and lobbying politicians and regular debates in Parliament, which still go on, and we have an input into that, successive Home Secretaries are now continuing to refuse to meet us. They don't even meet us at all now. And we've not even got anywhere with the shadow Home Secretary. I don't think any of you in this room will be that surprised to hear that, but we're still trying to get a meeting with the shadow Home Secretary, and we hope that we can, just to remind them that we're still around for a start. But I don't know whether many of you are aware of what happened recently in Scotland in 2022. A lot of the miners in Scotland who were convicted of offences relating to the strike were given a collective pardon, and the Scottish Parliament had organised that. They weren't given any compensation, and I think there are a few still going to fight through for that, but we're hoping that collective pardon will highlight some of the issues that happened all over Britain. So basically, we're still here, we're not giving up. We're pretty proud to say that we're not going to give up, you know, like I'm sure all of you in this room, we're pretty conscientious political activists, and we're pretty determined to carry on with this campaign. And I think we're creating quite a good awareness among younger generations, because I think there are many of you in this room who will realise that the injustices that the miners experienced are the injustices that you and other people are experiencing right now. And that because of what happened during that strike, we are now in this political situation. So in order to keep us going and not to get too demoralised, we get involved in quite a few creative stunts and activities. We've taken cardboard cutouts of Norman Tebbit and Margaret Thatcher to the Home Office with letters, and we've got dressed up in fancy dress for Halloween, because that was the day that Amber Rudd told us there'd be no inquiry. So we've been a bit creative and grabbed a few headlines. And we work with other campaigns as well. We've worked quite closely with Justice for Grenfell, Shrewsbury 24 campaign, Hillsborough campaigns. And we take some sort of, we're very heartened really, because the Shrewsbury 24 campaign had a victory. They managed to overturn the prosecution and convictions of the North Wales building workers who were charged with alleged picketing offences following the first national building workers' strike in 1972. So all this has been going on for rather a long time. So as I said before, next year is the 40th anniversary of the miners' strike, and we're going to be involved in quite a lot of events to commemorate, but also to celebrate, because what we want to celebrate is the incredible solidarity that happened throughout that strike. It wasn't a complete defeat. It was a defeat for the miners and the trade union movement, but for a lot of us, it brought a lot out of us. It brought a lot of support for each other. It taught us skills that we might not have had, and it taught us a lot about solidarity. We have an annual rally. It's the nearest Saturday to the 18th of June every year, and this year it's the 17th of June in Sheffield. We used to have it at Orgreave, but because the landscape's changed so much, it's difficult to have a rally there. So I've brought some posters. If any of you could please take some away and stick them around various workplaces over the next week, or education establishments, or fly post, or we've got some stickers that you can put in places. And come along and join us. Bring your banners, bring your friends, make your placards, and it'd be really lovely to see you all there. Thanks for asking me.